I really want to unify with this beautiful white violet light, there's a pause. And my angelics, or the celestial beings that were accompanying me, let it be known that I was a fractal of that light. All life, all creative intelligence was a fractal of that light. And I would return to that light, surely, now or later. Yet there was a choice to be made. Should I continue onward in my journey and unify with that light, I would stay and become of it in this space. There were no loaded words like heaven, but at the same token, there was the awareness that this was the point of origin for all living beings.
Hello, thank you for tuning in. My name is Nella, and welcome to my podcast, Ethereality. Today's guest is Brooke Grove. Brooke had a beautiful near-death experience. Traveling to a place that resembled the cosmos, she met some very interesting light beings and saw what she described as potential visions or even prophecies of the earth. Brooke's going to share her journey of dying and coming back with some interesting after effects and how she's learned to integrate all of this. Thank you so much, Brooke, for being here. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your near-death experience?
Thank you. In 2010, I had been battling complex autoimmunity for quite some time, approximately 4 years, and I'd seen a variety of specialists, yet wasn't getting a congruent, consistent diagnosis. And so I went for treatment at Hopkins back east, and before I got there, I actually ended up having an autoimmune flare. And I called the doctors back in California and asked what to do. They instructed me to double up my medication. They felt that there would be no consequence to this as it was a benign amount. However, they had missed that my liver was also failing. So when I took medication to treat the pain and the asthma, I ended up unintentionally shutting down my liver. My NDE begins in the ICU of Hopkins. I saw a team working on a body. And at first it was somewhat dreamlike and I was curious. And so I came closer to the treatment team. I noticed they were wearing hazmat gear and that it seemed to be a very dire situation, yet I couldn't really understand what was happening. As I zoomed in closer, I began to realize that the person they were treating was me. And there was a moment of panic and of ownership to that body. And as I'm beginning to realize that I'm separate from it, I'm pulled very, very, very quickly out of this realm into another space. And this space, for lack of an ability to define it in a way that's articulative and clear enough, really was like outer space. It was as if I was pulled up into the cosmos. Instantaneously, there are deep pockets of blackness, and there are these poetic pockets of light. They are moving very, very, very quickly. There are orbs, and these orbs appear to communicate, to have knowings, to sense senses, sensations, feelings. I recognize a few of these lights. These lights had accompanied me throughout my childhood. I had described them as angelics to my family and been teased quite often, yet here, once again, were these hues, this beautiful red ruby color, this beautiful emerald-like color, and also an amethyst color. There was also a beautiful blue that assisted me throughout it. I recognized them as if I were being reintroduced to family I had known throughout this incarnation. They did not call themselves celestial beings. They did not describe themselves in any way. Yet on a heart level, I knew them and they knew me. And there was a symmetry and a love and a connection that went beyond what I had known of loved ones on earth. In this space, as I felt into them, I was carried by this palpable, unconditional love. And though there was this infinite white violet like light calling to me, I was so enamored to be in this juicy quality of acceptance where there was no separation, where I was part of it, it was part of me, and the only knowing was unity, was peace, was bliss. I begin to be attracted to this magnetic source or creator light that is at the center of this cosmos-like space. And as I'm coming towards it, information is coming through me. It is not being spoken to me in any type of human-like way with agenda, with force. Yet as I'm moving through these lights, I'm seeing information. I'm receiving visions or perhaps prophecies of what might accompany a return to this earth. Again, these words are not used. However, this energy is moving through me, and there's something about it that I deeply resonate with. So as I'm coming towards this creator light, I'm simultaneously somewhat slowing down to receive these images. There wasn't time to analyze or comprehend, but I very clearly remember multiple images of the earth. And the earth each time was surrounded in this citrine gold-like energy. And all of these light beings had what looked almost like human hands, and they're putting forth this light onto this circular representation of the earth. And each time the earth seems to be emitting more and more and more light. So I'm just curious about this, and I feel for some reason as if I'm connected to those hands. Yet again, there's no clarity, there's no direct information. I just keep going. As I meet the infinite, the source light, the creator, there is this call, almost as if a magnet is pulling from the center of my own light orb, which I couldn't see, yet I could feel. Because when I would come into resonance with other lights, what I would notice is that I emitted the color. It was as if we would just unify, and I would become blue, or I would become red, or I would become purple. As I'm pausing to allow these different energies and lights to come through, I'm noticing that though I really want to unify with this beautiful white violet light, there's a pause. And my angelics, or the celestial beings that were accompanying me, let it be known that I was a fractal of that light. All life, all creative intelligence was a fractal of that light. And I would return to that light, surely, now or later. Yet there was a choice to be made. Should I continue onward in my journey and unify with that light, I would stay and become of it in this space. There were no loaded words like heaven, but at the same token, there was the awareness that this was the point of origin for all living beings. And yet, I didn't want to unify with it in that moment of awareness. The images that they had downloaded into me of the earth, of the shift, of other light beings, of a unified field, really pulled at my awareness. I was comatose as this is occurring, so I'm very much in between. A period of 3.5 days, I'm in this state. Yet there is no time. It felt as if I was in this eternal pause that was completely allowed. My curiosity, my uncertainty were divinely loved, as were my questions. All was welcome, all was held. It was then that the light beings let me know I had the opportunity to return. And if I were to return, I would have the opportunity to collaborate and to be part of the light team that would assist the earth. Again, there were no clear instructions as to what would happen and when. However, I knew that that was essential to my soul. It was also made known to me at that point that if I returned to the light, I would continue in the state of eternal peace and bliss and this just exquisite divinity I hadn't tasted in my human life. And yet, if I went back, there would be struggle, there would be discord, there would be more trauma. The part of me that was still connected to my oversoul or my human body hesitated for a moment at that. And yet my light beings filled me up with such an unconditional love and strength and fortitude that some part of me understood it was time to go back. As I sat in that space making that choice, I then asked, I see infinite space. How do I get back? Which direction do I go? And the angelics instructed me to look for a light unlike any other. As I'm going to meet this light, which I'm imagining will be a different intensity or announce itself differently, I do encounter two other lights. One being this yummy indigo color that I have yet to see on Earth in this hue and intensity. And the other one being this grassy green. And as I paused to be in their presence, unlike the other lights, which had communicated so much light intelligence or light consciousness, these two said nothing. And unlike the other lights, which had held me and made me feel tender and precious, I intuitively felt I needed to hold them and be in their space. But absolutely nothing was communicated. I paused, looked at them curiously, and continued. At that point, I meet the light unlike any other. It is this horrific, very intense, yellow, but not a pretty kind of like an emergency light. And I am then catapulted following that light back into the body, wherein I open my very human eye and meet the yellow flashlight of the neurologist who was checking my vitals. And that's what pulled me back in.
Tell me more about the two lights that you encountered.
I wouldn't come to know those lights or what it meant for 3 years following coma. I was told due to the significant extent of the organ damage, I had had my liver, my lungs, my kidneys fail, all of them. I'd had a traumatic brain injury. Because of all of this, it was a low probability I'd make a full recovery. And the one proclamation that medical science had made was I would never have children. The organs would not support the birth of children. I didn't see that in my deck of cards as a potentiality based on hearing that over and over and over again for years. And then 3 years later, as I'm struggling to really human and integrate this experience, I find out I'm pregnant, and I was about to defend my dissertation, and I was about to really surrender and do what the academics wanted, even though it wasn't in alignment to who I was becoming. And it was my third attempt. And then I find out I'm pregnant. I could feel from the very beginning of this soul developing within me that this was an intuitive child, that it, for lack of better terms, was an indigo or starseed child. And I trusted my intuition so much that I sought out other NDErs to confirm or deny this, perhaps, one of them being PMH Atwater. And I reach out to her and I tell her I'm pregnant. There is a child that's defying all medical science and choosing to grow. And I just feel this real deep resonance with the soul. And she told me in no uncertain terms, didn't you pray for someone like you and your family? And I said, my whole childhood. And I thought God did not hear me. Let it be known that when I go through this very difficult pregnancy and birth, and it was a very difficult pregnancy, I had hyperemesis where I could keep nothing down. I lost 12 pounds in my first trimester. So it was difficult bringing him in. And then I did 27 hours of natural childbirth before he ended up with heart problems and I had to have an emergency cesarean. Yet as they're pulling him out, I see this blinding indigo. And I just start crying. It was you, it was you, it was you. And they put him in my arms and I knew I would never walk this earth another day alone. That I had this person who was willing to see me in the stars and guide me back. And that in some way was a teacher. And I very much know that in other incarnations, he was my teacher and I was his student. So we switched the roles a little bit here. But later, when he's about 3 years old, I knew he was intuitive. I knew he was highly sensitive. I knew he had all the gifts, but I did not want to indoctrinate him the way I had been indoctrinated with religion and the way it had backfired against me in the Catholic Church. And so I waited for him to give me a sign. And one day when he was about 3 or 3.5, we're reading a story about the stars. And he pauses me and he goes, Mama? And I go, yes. He goes, thank you for choosing me. I go, choosing you where? How? And he goes, in the stars when you went back to your body. To have a child tell you that, it was the only validation I'd received of my NDE. My family didn't have that awareness or capacity. And yet here was this little boy, and he hasn't faltered in being that strong and that open. I mean, when the pandemic hit and I was telling him what was going on, he said, Mama, don't worry. This is why we're here. It's the great undoing. It'll fall apart and we'll rebuild it. And that's that, with a confidence that I just didn't have. And so what a gift. And then 4 years later, I met the green that became my youngest leaf.
I'm trying not to cry. That is such a beautiful story.
Thank you.
After you came back, did you at any point doubt the validity of your experience?
Pretty much from the moment I opened my eyes. I had been trained as a clinical psychologist. I was a marriage and family therapist at that point. I thought I'd had like a really good lucid dream, or that someone had given me some really good drugs. When I woke up, I was noticing that there was stuff moving on top of like normal stuff, like the monitors on top of the electricity. And what you're seeing, there was just like all these colors and stuff dancing around. I noticed on people or anything that was emoting that it would intensify, and that I could just like watch people move their hands because there was like a symphony of color and things that were occurring. Now, again, I've just woken up. No one's really told me that it was an accidental medical error overdose and that the liver had been failing, and they didn't know that. So I don't know what caused any of this. I just know that I'm in ICU. So as soon as the intubator's out and I'm able to communicate days later, I'm asking everyone to take the drugs away, turn the drugs down. I don't want to be on these drugs anymore. It's really overwhelming. And at that point, that's when the nurse kind of laughs and she's like, sweetie, your liver failed. We can't even give you Benadryl. And I started to realize that everything I was seeing was something that had changed in my brain. And so they're telling me I have a traumatic brain injury. Well, obviously, something's wrong. I'm seeing all this stuff. It's going to go away. Obviously, it'll go away. I'm asking the neurologist if, when I hit my head, did it alter me somehow? And they're telling me, well, yeah, obviously this and this happened, but, your brain scans look normal. You have full cognition. You're a miracle. You're so lucky. And I'm thinking to myself, if I'm a miracle and I'm so lucky, why am I seeing all of this stuff? So very quietly, after I pass all my mental status exams and all the stuff they put you through in this kind of situation, I start giving them to myself as a licensed clinician. And I'm noticing I'm oriented ×4, which in clinical nomenclature is time, person, place, situation. If you're oriented to all 4, then clinically speaking, you're not psychotic. Well, if I wasn't having some form of psychosis or hallucinating, what the hell was I seeing? And so I had to really begin to allow myself to play with the curiosity instead of labeling it so black and white, which is what the scientists within me wanted to do. I had to understand that perhaps there was a gateway or something that opened in this experience that was communicating in a language that I saw as scary and foreign. But what if perhaps it was beyond my perception? It was beyond my knowledge base at that time. And that's when, out of desperation, because I was living in ICU, watching people code red and code blue all night long, now able to see the energy body and the light body, not understanding, I had to get curious, get playful, and have a completely open beginner's mind in order to stay sane and to ultimately get out of there. And so that's what I did.
That intensity of your experience seeing these colors and energies, did it ever die down over any amount of time?
I would say it maybe had plateaus when I was really calm. And I did learn that I didn't like to engage a lot of family or certain doctors because there was an intensity to how we were approaching each other that would heighten it. So I liked persons that were more dry, clinical, grounded, because they didn't spark all of those energies and activities. I would say I started learning pretty quickly that technology, it could heighten it, but it could also buffer it. So there were times where a certain aunt would come in and she was super animated, and I would kind of go get near the technology because it would buffer her energy and bring mine own down. And now I totally understand that, as you've seen my after effects and some of the wonky stuff. Technology, because it's an energy system itself, can either act as a hindrance or a conduit. It just depends. But what I noticed the most is that for whatever reason, there were periods in the night that it seemed to be more active. And that tended to be what we would typically call the witching hours, when most people would also transition in ICU. So it was definitely like a light bulb, and you were kind of learning what frequencies lit it up and what other ones kind of muted it.
And that experience of being able to observe those energies has never completely faded.
No. I unfortunately, and I say this with love because I witness this in my practice now as I work with experiencers, there are means and modalities that are very normative in our culture, such as drinking, drugs, bad food, television, those kind of things. Anything that's at a lower vibration is going to pull my gifts down. Okay, because they thrive in the highest vibration. However, if I want to turn it off, great way to turn it off would be prescription medicine, alcohol, things of that nature. And so early on, as I was still being treated for health issues, I learned maladaptively that I could control the after effects with these substances. If I didn't want them on, okay, take your medication, because they go away. And that's dangerous if you're struggling to accept a situation and you're struggling to love it. And I see that with a lot of experiencers where they self-medicate to turn off some of the non-normative after effects.
As far as your religious trauma goes, how have you learned to integrate all of that with what you now know post near-death experience?
I've gotten faulted in the past for talking about soul contracts, which can really, trigger some people. But again, any trigger we experience or activation is a cue to where we have ongoing healing. So if that occurs in this conversation for anyone, I welcome it, self included. Okay, these are invitations from our higher selves. That said, understanding that we have an oversoul that does carry a divine blueprint, and in that, certain conditions might help that divine blueprint to manifest, I can see why my oversoul chose a difficult incarnation here. I'm not saying I welcome the multitudes of abuses that have come forth, nor would I wish anyone to pick a contract such as mine. However, I know that incarnating into the family I came into with this strict Roman Catholic upbringing and a very black or white way of seeing things, including spirituality, was what I needed to kind of spring forth into many other paths. I see much of the religious traumas that I endured as a catalyst for my soul and helping other persons. I don't feel that my religious traumas in any way were the most prolific of my abuses, but they taught me at a very young age how systems of power can, in their own right, be highly harmful, and how to the sensitive soul, particularly the feminine in patriarchal religions, we have to do a lot better. And as the divine feminine is awakening and the wounded masculine and the patriarchy is really starting to act out and crumble, I'm grateful for the opportunities. I'm grateful for what those institutions taught me so that I can co-create with other awakening divine feminines and masculines a healthier system, a healthier way of being that takes into accountability where we failed for eons.
Well said.
Thank you.
Were you on that path of integration before you had your near-death experience?
I will say I was curious. Again, I'd been in clinical psychology, but I was already starting to feel a pull towards like Jung and more depth psychology and away from psychoanalytic, which still unfortunately runs how they license us and train us, despite the fact it's archaic in so many ways. So I was feeling that calling, yet I wasn't yet awakened to terms like divine feminine or sacred union. I just knew that what I was getting in school, it was like the deeper I'd go with every degree, the more questions I had. So it was almost like this rabbit hole that just keeps going and going and going. And it wasn't till I came back, I went from this fervent agnostic. I mean, I was borderline atheist in my disdain for the church and organized religion at that time. And yet, when I came back and started understanding that I was seeing the energy field and chakras and meridians and things that had been talking about, in Hinduism and other esoteric wisdom traditions, including shamanism in the indigenous tribes here in the Americas, I was like, okay, there's something here that's speaking to me. I just don't yet know what it is. So much of it was buried and suppressed for us as a culture, which is why collectively we're awakening to it now. But for me, when you look at spiritual traditions and not see a woman as a leader over and over and over again, that was a distaste. That was like, well, okay, this isn't for me. Where do I need to keep looking? Where do I need to keep looking? Until eventually I started understanding how much of the goddess and the matriarchy and these really beautiful, wholesome cultures were purposely buried, purposely destroyed. And then that became a cause to action as to help others in our awakening world.
I love that you were called towards that.
Thank you.
One thing I am very intrigued by is the fact that there are near-death experiencers now utilizing ketamine for integration. At what point was that put on your radar?
I was aware of ketamine in the NDE population years before I myself had any orientation towards it. I had seen successful outcomes, and I was aware of the research, which was suggesting that it could have a major breakthrough as far as suicidality and the efficacy of that treatment. Historically, suicide has been a very difficult thing to treat in mental health care, and hence we have the black box label on many psychotropic meds because, quite frankly, they can make it worse. You start feeling better, and then you can actually complete and act on suicide ideation. And so suicide was an intimate part of my story, and it was an intimate part of why I began to share. And then during the height of the pandemic, as I was helping experiencers across the world and going through my own personal familial shift in dynamics and a divorce, I went through another bout of suicide ideation, and it really rocked me because I didn't see it coming. And it got fast and dark very quickly. I was having flooding. I was attempting to write about my trauma, and I was flooding in my sleep. And I would wake up as if I were attacking the person who had harmed me, but I was actually harming myself in my sleep. And I knew how fast that could escalate and the shame that was getting stirred up. And so at that point, I said, okay, if this is what they're advocating might be a high efficacy for suicidal ideation, and I don't know, and my only experience with this drug is what I'm aware of it as a club drug, and that's a bias that's been programmed into me, why don't I give it a fresh try? If it's really helped this many friends, I went and did the research. I found the efficacy to be as high as they were suggesting, which really shocked me to consistently see that over and over again, and that people could do a couple sessions and come out without ideation. And so I signed up to do one, and I don't really know what I was expecting initially, but it was nothing like an NDE. And I had kept hearing that comparison. So, part of me is like, oh yeah, I'm going in, I'm going to see God. It's going to be, all the things I described in the beginning. It wasn't like that. In fact, I had to keep asking them to turn it up because they were giving it based on weight. And I have all of these after effects that are like being on psychedelics all the time. It wasn't doing anything to me. And so I needed a higher level of dissociation. Well, once they got me to that spot, then I was like, okay, I get it. You're detached from the body, yet you're still aware that you're taking some sort of agent to help heal. And yet you are connected to that unified field. You can kind of orient your way through. So for me, as I was kind of catapulted back into the body and it was so broken, post-coma. And then I was accused because the medical staff didn't want to admit that they made a mistake. I was initially accused of an overdose intentionally. So it was a really horrible way to wake up. And so since I knew I had 6 sessions that I could do this in, my callback was always coming into the body with choice, coming into the body with love, landing into the body ready to serve. So for 6 sessions, I really worked on that. And it was, for me, the perfect setting to do it in, because you were in a hospital, you were being monitored, you were laying down. The conditions were so congruent to how I woke up in ICU. And so I started knowing I could control how I would land, how I would perceive things when I awoke. And so the integration began the moment you land. I had flowers waiting for me, a welcome back sign, like all of the kinds of things that would have been a soft and yummy landing that weren't there, I made sure I had. And so ketamine gave me the ability to be in a semi-altered state, but still congruent to my higher self, and still aware that I was taking something to co-create change. And I feel that if that drug, or any plant medicine or psychedelic for that matter, is used with that type of integrity, with intentionality, supported by your guides for the purpose of healing, they are transformational catalysts. However, if they're used without intentionality, if they're used just to escape, it's a different story. How we choose to accept our influence by anything that alters us defines if it will be of service or not. For me, I walked out of there, the suicidality went away that week. I've never had it come back. That was 2 years ago. And I now know that if there's other persons in my population, as I do work with experiencers and mystical experiencers predominantly, this is a great agent that is readily available and now being paid for by insurance. Kaiser's paying for full sessions now. Other insurances will soon follow. But again, it's about your intentionality and your consciousness in meeting it. If you expect it to change you without doing the work, it can't do that. However, if you activate its ability to transform and you assist it, profound shifts can occur very quickly.
If you're getting any value out of this podcast, please hit that like button and subscribe. Also, if you've enjoyed my content before, or maybe you're new here, but you like it, drop a comment and let me know you're here. I would love to get to know my audience. Thank you for listening, and let's get back to the content. Did you have any guidance on your mindset, or was your approach entirely formulated by you?
I had been fortunate when I was in my doctoral studies. We could see the shift towards psychedelics was coming way back then, which was 10 years before I'm utilizing them. So I had the privilege of actually being trained by many of the pioneers in psychedelic research, which had just kind of stuck with me. So I took what they had said, but really following my own guidance, and created a protocol. I also was very cognizant that before I took the drug, to research everything I could on ketamine and integrative therapies and things of that nature. I have since told many persons, if I didn't have that training myself, and if I didn't have that research, I would always advocate for a guide. Yet as it's in my area of expertise and it's work I've done so deeply, I was comfortable doing it that way. You know, one thing that I think is fascinating that kind of I feel sometimes gets glossed over is the ongoing work of integration. Like, persons always ask me, like, how is it integrating? But I have friends who have been in the NDE community since it began being a public community that are still very much integrating. That's part of it, I think, that persons don't always get. You don't ever get to this perfectly healed and sealed light bulb moment. You're constantly working through shadow layers of the integration, and you're being tested. It's very easy if you go on social media right now to see NDEers getting tested by their limited belief systems, because they may advocate unconditional love and yet they get triggered by politics or whatever else, and they slip into their very human way of being. So for me, as someone who's always been an observer and likes to kind of stay outside and watch everything and then speak up once I start seeing some patterns, I just find it interesting how we don't really talk about that. I have many NDE friends who have gone through pretty significant life changes recently and have been very frank that that life change almost makes them feel like they're starting all over with the NDE, because the way they perceive the world is yet again being challenged. And then that makes you kind of go through those messy layers. You know, you'd think that they get like easier to navigate when you go through them, but sometimes it seems like they get messier or the questions get bigger. And I've made it my passion to live my questions out loud and own the mess and be raw and vulnerable. Yet it's pretty fascinating how we're kind of all baby stepping through this together, whether you're newly awakening or you've kind of had many, many experiences. We're constantly going through that nonlinear spiral together.
Absolutely. I mean, we're all in process. Actually, progmess is what a friend of mine calls it.
It works.
There's no end to that journey.
As we're ascending, it's like one day you have this like, whoa, super intense. The next day it's, oh, I just want to be in my pajamas. And everyone seems to like take that somewhat personally when I talk to people who are like, oh, I'm having a bad day. It's like, no, that's the collective right now. It's just on fire 1 minute and then it's like, wah. It's a lot. It's intense. And we're all like receiving it, and how we interpret the frequency is highly unique, but we're in it together.
We are. As far as people in the near-death experience world, who would you say had the biggest impact on you when you started exploring it?
Ooh. I would say when I first started exploring it, it was on the research end, the people that impacted me. Dr. Bruce Grayson had a huge impact because I didn't directly communicate with him. It was a lot of nonverbal communication when we were in the same places at conferences and stuff. I was shy. I wasn't speaking at that time, but I had certain nonverbal cues, like wearing my sunglasses all the time due to my after effects, that he picked up on. And rather than like, be aggressive or anything like that, he was very gentle and would be like, oh, are you experiencing? And hearing that from a doctor, at the time when I was struggling with it, it really helped me that he understood that these phenomena that were really overwhelming my system can be really intense, and normalized that. And that made me feel safe and gave me kind of a cushion. PMH Atwater was a huge influence, mostly because she had that rebel, badass, divine feminine warrior and playful. She's like an eternal child, and you see her and she's in her 80s, but she's just laughing and grinning ear to ear. She gave me the awareness that you didn't have to take it so seriously and you could have fun. Like, it's very serious, but you can be playful about it and jovial and childlike. She also normalized the starseed aspect, which early in my NDE explorations was not part of the nomenclature in that group. Nobody was talking about it, and we were kind of pigeonholed, like across mystical experiences, and I didn't really love that. When I began to speak, my soul brother, Peter Panagore, became a huge influence because we have an intuitive flow-based way of speaking, whereas his comes from a Christian mystic side and mine comes from more of a organic, divine feminine, shamanistic side. We were able to always find middle ground with each other, and his confidence and his way of just being fully present with persons was very medicinal. It also helped me on a personal note that his NDE occurred the year my human animal was born in this realm. So he's been doing the heart and holy integration work literally as long as my vessel's been here. And every time we have these really in-depth conversations, it just reminds me that it's okay to have, A+ days followed by a day where you feel like you're failing. That's being human, and experiencers are very much still human beings. I feel that persons that can own that and kind of be more raw with where they're having growth opportunities are whom I resonate with most in our community.
Are you involved in any other organizations about near-death experiences aside from IONS?
Mostly everything's an offshoot. I do a lot with parapsychological associations because they study near-death phenomena. Somewhat with mediumship organizations because, again, the doors are open to us. I do a lot with transpersonal psychology because, again, that umbrella is beginning to open and the clinical world is starting to receive it. That wasn't the case when I was in school, so it's a welcome shift that I enjoy. I am doing a lot through organizations that are associated to MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, because, again, there's so much of an overlap to where these potential future therapies intersect with an NDE-like unified field of unity consciousness. So, we're at a time right now where we're kind of like pigeonholed in all these different directions and these different disciplines. But the way that I see it is that science and spirit will realize that they've been saying the same things in different ways for a very long time. And all of these labels will begin to dissolve as we come into unity within all of the disciplines and spirituality as a whole and the arts.
I like that you brought up the language. Mm-hmm. Saying the same things in different ways is a major setback between, say, Christianity and the more spiritual side of things. Early in my life, I recognized this and felt like I had something to do with creating a bridge. Bridging the divide between spiritual and religion. For example, they talk about angels in Christianity, whereas a lot of times in spirituality, they talk about spirit guides. But Christianity has demonized the concept of spirit guides, which is strange because it's like, by definition, aren't you talking about the same thing? And that's just one example. There's a lot of different things where they're talking about the same things, yet because it's on the other side of the fence, bad,
Oh, I concur. I mean, with my religious trauma, I disclosed when I was about 7, because my youngest son is 7 now. I see it in him all the time. But I had told my cousins that I was interacting with angelics and celestial beings, and that, I had these relationships, and we would have fun playing out in the garden, doing all this thing. But I was the oldest one. And when she told her mom, that basically we were talking to angels and seeing lights and all of that, it was demonized. And yet I would go to school and I was supposed to worship these children in Fatima and praise this miracle and acknowledge all of that as real. But because it was happening to me in a normative setting outside of this larger social construct, it wasn't real. And why would it be any less real for any other child than it would for those children? And so I learned very quickly, it's okay if the Bible says it's okay, but it's not okay if it's happening in your literal backyard. Then it's witchcraft.
That doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make any sense. But part of it is we get into these energy projections that are like quite loaded, that come from the way that we're programmed. And often I feel that the infighting is that we're weaponizing the projection. We're not meeting their celestial beings, no matter what you call it. Like, that's the truth. The celestial being is communicating. But because I'm calling it an angel and they're calling it that, or if you call it a spirit guide, the attack comes from the language and the projection to that language versus actually what's being said. It becomes about our identity and our ego. So if we identify as a mystic or if we identify as a Christian, then our associations to what that identity means often becomes what we get in trouble with. Like if I identify as a Christian, but I say I interact with spirit guides and that's not normative to the faith, that's where people get all jungled up. Okay. When in fact, it's very normative for Christians to have encounters with celestial guides of any type. But we're getting caught up in the language. And because the language is associated, for better or worse, to a side or an ideology, we get stuck in that and we miss the bigger picture of what's actually happening.
I really think it's important for people to be more open-minded about that.
Yes, with clients, when I meet persons, I always pay attention when an experiencer comes into the language they're using. Because sometimes it's very evident that they're speaking from a really indoctrinated religious perspective. And there's no room for me to talk about certain things using language that's going to set them off. And I know that. I don't want to spend all my time talking about vernacular and why you don't like certain terms. I want to get to the meat of things. And yet with other people, they will come in with what's clearly a certain type of slant towards a certain types of ideology, but their palette of language is much more expansive. And I instantaneously know, okay, they have an inclusive approach to this. They might be devout Roman Catholic, but there's an inclusiveness to other spiritual paths. So it's very telling how we choose to communicate and what that says about our core beliefs.
Do you feel like having your near-death experience in any way shattered your lens on life or your identity?
To my ego's dismay, it shattered my identity in multitudes of ways. I mean, it's kind of like, and this is not unique to just me, but I'm going to use myself as the example here because it's easier. But I can tell you that, for many NDEers, we have this dichotomy of like how the community receives us, because us post NDE, doing the work out there. But there's all these people who knew us pre NDE. And when you come back, they don't just let you graduate from being that person. They often project, Brooke the scientist or Brooke the clinician. So there's people that I had to learn I could not be in relation with anymore because they didn't have the capacity to let me outgrow her. She was like the skin I was constantly trying to shed. And I could never fully be this new person if I was carrying the weight of her. And I can tell you from having this conversation with so many NDEers, I mean, there's people that stay in dead marriages for decades because they don't want to have a divorce when they still have religious programming that's part of their NDE. And so they just stay miserable because they think that that's better. I don't have that capacity in me. If I'm not in flow and things aren't aligning and I don't feel the juiciness of life, then I'm not going to want to be in resonance with something. So I tend to pull myself out of those situations. But there are many people I've known who wait till almost their rocking chair moment to own their NDE and how they are not the person they're walking around pretending to be. They simply kept doing that because it made life simpler. So ego death, I say that that's kind of the building block of integration as you come out, and you have to quickly decide, am I going to be this person? I tried for 3 years. My son, the indigo, he really shook me up by coming into this world and saying, you're going down a path you don't align with. You just keep trying. So here I am. And it was the same way with my youngest Leaf. I always joke, they picked moments that their incarnation forced me to pivot from going back to the old. And each time they came in, it was like, no, this is serious. You've got to go another way. This way won't be the easy way. It will be messy, but it will teach you more. So I would say ego death, and it's not like this one profound, healed and sealed, move on. It's this kind of shattering of this old mosaic of who you were. And there's an honoring of the parts you need to carry with you. And there's a grief too for the parts that you maybe didn't want to let go of, but to become this new person or this new composite of identities, you have to be willing to let that old. But you can do it with love. When I see those parts, that might have been the parts that pissed those other people off or gave me a bad reputation with them, now I can say, okay, I meet her with love. I understand her wounding. I understand why she gets so loud. I understand why she wants to play when I'm over here in the celestial land and she doesn't want to be forgotten about. Okay, so she's part of the identity. She's just not running the show. And quite often when you return, the majority of people in your life, they're going to want the old to run the show because it makes it easier and you can just pick up the pieces and move on. The reason our divorce rate is so high in the NDE community is very few people can pick up those old pieces and move on. So in a country where divorce is well over 55% or so, we are in the 80 to 90% group because people come back entirely changed. And when they attempt to be the old, they can't do it. And that makes relationships quite difficult.
So you referred to ego death. Can you explain what that is in your understanding for anyone listening who's not familiar?
Ego death gets it's better now in spiritual communities. But once upon a time, there was this posturing of like, you got to kill the ego to really understand the higher self and all of that. First off, that's impossible because we all are going to have a part of the ego that must be intact for us to thrive. The ego is for protection, okay? And it is a wonderful servant, but it is a terrible master. And much of what we're noticing in this world are people running around with the ego running the show. And the ego wants the old. Anytime the lower mind's involved, it's going to choose what it knows. It will repeat the most dysfunctional pattern just to tell you, see, I told you. Because again, it's going off of lived experience, past experience. Its sole function is an animal part of the brain to protect you. If there's a tiger, run. That's when the ego is good. That's when it has its highest attributes. However, when we start to identify the self from the place of ego, and we start to see our whole based on this very limited, finite, wounded perspective, we get into a lot of trouble. Again, because the ego is constantly growing and shifting, there might be layers that have to die simultaneously. For me, very clear example, the doctor had to die. That part of the white coat trajectory, it had to go because I no longer was it. I could keep that foundation, but it wasn't carrying me anymore. Other parts as a survivor, like the fighter, that part needed to stay. There were parts of my trajectory that needed that fighting, that protection, that survival mechanism in it. However, if the fighter were to become my primary ego identity, I wouldn't be able to do any of this because she won't connect. She doesn't trust. She's coming off of all of her programming. So it's not as if we have one finite whole ego that dies, but to be a human is a constant progression of ego deaths. You allow the wisdom of one part of your identity to serve you until you realize it's become a hindrance. When that part starts to self-harm, that's when we cast it aside. If it speaks even louder, then that's that part saying, I am holding a pattern that's core to you. I'm holding something that you need to alchemize, you need to heal. And then you have a new part that rises to meet you. My bias is we will be going through nonlinear processes of ego death the entirety we are human. It is not some destination you can check off. It is a recurrence of meeting the shadow, meeting what you perceive to be the self. Remember, your perception is always going to separate and split. That will be the lower mind and the ego. At the higher self and the higher mind, there is no separation. So from the higher self perspective, that wound, that acted out part, that ego that's dying is a part of me. I'm not going to meet that with anger. I'm going to meet it with love, with unconditionality. Ego death is just really an invitation to understand that the lower mind has debris in it. And that debris will define us until we change our relationship with it. And once we do that, ego death becomes a gateway or a portal into the family of selves that really are the higher self in the higher dimensions.
Absolutely. The objective should not be to completely eliminate the ego, rather to create a healthy ego.
Yes. Ultimately, if we are successful in the constant dance of reintegration with that, the healthy ego will become the gatekeeper to the higher self. So the higher self is really coming through, through the ego itself. And that's where you see someone working through their ego limitations in service. But they're doing it with integrity. They're doing it with candor, and they're owning their biases and where they're struggling. And that's really it, is that tenderness to be with, as in Tantra, we call it the union, the whole. There's been this discourse, which I love, that we're talking about the shadow so much, but we're not talking about the shadow in relationship to the light. It's the same thing with the light. We're looking at the light. No, we want to see, where is their union? When are they in harmony? And when is there discord? And how do we bring that into our world? Because we are all living with these polarities, these dualities, these hindrances, and these gifts within us. So it's all about getting them into communication so that we then can shift the narrative. And that first begins by self-identity and knowing where we have those parts and where they can be an obstacle.
There's balance, the shadows and the light.
Definitely. And that's what nature knows. If you really look at nature as a language of God, as a reflection, if everything is consciousness, if God is consciousness and everything is consciousness, nature is the most poetic expression of that, because nature understands that light needs darkness and darkness needs light, and on and on and on and on and on. So the more we start to understand the things that we might label good or bad are really just our intrinsic natures. My light is my nature, my shadow is my nature. How may they dance together to create more beautiful weather rather than be a raging storm?
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love the way you put that. That is so poetic. Do you have anything to add before I ask you my favorite closing question?
I would say we're just in these really ultra powerful, intense, but thrilling times right now. And from the conversation that we were just having, my invitation to your audience would to be really to approach this period and the opportunity here with what, again, to go back to Tantra, I love their language and the way they communicate things in unity, is what my teachers call sky mind, which means any weather, anything can pass through. And when it passes through, it's like, oh, that's lightning. Oh, that's a cloud. Oh, hey, grief, what's up? Ooh, a little piece of happiness. I'll take that. You don't identify with it because what's coming through is just what happens to the sky. The mind has thoughts. The mind self-attacks. The mind has ego. That's just mind being mind. It's not a reflection of you. It's a reflection of the heart and holy human animal and how it was designed. So allow things to happen, allow the thoughts, allow the reactions, allow the opinions to occur. Don't take so much ownership in it. See it as an eternally moving sky, and the hues and the information and the intelligence is eternally shifting, but it will always be sky, and it will always be in flux.
Like taking the observer approach.
The difference here is you're not in a cold neutrality. You know, like if there was a distance, like, you know, you kind of like you're fully back. Like in science, you want to be completely observing and not a participant, or else it's a dual relationship. Okay. With the sky mind, you actually are participating with it, but your identity is not derived from it. Anything can happen in the sky. The sky could go full on having a peak transcendent experience, but Brooke is not the transcendent experience, or NELLA is not. We are just part of the poetry, part of the sky. We're not taking ownership of being all sky. And that helps because our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, they are ancestrally and cellularly and collectively programmed. And we take way too much ownership in I, the individual, or my thoughts bad, or my depression's bad, when in reality, it is a constellation of experiences that we have inherited. And if we can begin to see it that way with a little bit more awareness of it is part of, but I am not it, it becomes much easier to be gentler with ourselves and truly unconditionally loving as our Creator is with us.
So how can we take this information and make it applicable?
The easiest way is to look at where the ache is the deepest. And this is not what most people want to do. Where is the most prolific pain, and when does it come to say hello? I'll give a perfect example that I see a lot in my practice. Limiting beliefs are such an influence on why people can't achieve miracles. Okay, it's not because there aren't miracles. The universe is abundant in miracles. However, our frequency and vibration block them because we program to believe that we can't have it. Often that lack programming, or the way we look at ourselves, is the hindrance. And so I see all the time when I ask them to do mirror work, a lot of people have no desire to do mirror work because the first thing they're going to see when they look in the mirror is something critical. Or you know that person who every time they go in to, adjust their makeup or fix their hair, they're focusing on their nose or their whatever. They've got this one perceived body flaw or perception flaw, and they hyper focus on it. Whether that's a literal thing, like something you can see in the mirror, or something you just feel every time you engage the mirror, whatever is activating you or meeting you over and over and over is the invitation to be with the pain. All pain at its root wants to return to love. If we meet pain as not an obstacle, but actually a welcome mat to love, the areas we struggle to perceive and love ourselves as our Creator does are the holiest gateways. So really, you have to be willing to take a fearless inventory of what triggers me, or what every time I'm in relationship comes up over and over and over again. Or when I yell at my kids, it's about this, this, and this. Just find your pattern, because they're all over the place. But pick a pattern and start there with your relationship to, even if it's just a word. Like for me, shame. As a trauma survivor, there was so much shame. And shame was just this, it was too disgusting to even look at, because I'd been programmed to see it with such a guilt and, push it away. But it was only when I really started to look at shame, and when I act out of reverence to shame, when I push it away, how it just compounds and becomes this thing. But if I look at this thing that my ego wants to push away, and rather than pushing it away, I just sit with it, over time, this huge obstacle starts to just naturally shrink until you're almost looking at this pebble and like, where did this come from? Someone else put this in me. Someone else told me this was shameful. It's no longer this big, awful thing, because all of the other stories, all those other vibrations have now been kind of dissolved organically by my ability to be with it. It's just like if you're having a really hard time and all these people come to you and are like, oh, just do this, or oh, just do that, or you should do that. And then one person says, tell me how you're having a hard time. Let me sit there in your hard time with you. Let me hurt with you. That can shift everything because you were just witnessed. Suddenly, you don't need to fix or change. You were just allowed to be whatever you were. That's all shame. That's all rage. That's all hate. All these things at their core, the original trauma of when they separated from love, that's what wants to be witnessed. And if we can do that for ourselves, and it is a process, I am not going to sugarcoat it. It takes years of meeting it over and over and over again. But if you can learn to do that, you can shift and pivot out of anything, because you're going to understand over and over again that it is the things that we push away that will revolutionize our world.
It's 12:34.
Love that number.
1, 2, 3, 4. So before we close out, if there was one thing that you'd really love for people to grow in understanding of, what would that be?
The ability to radically, unapologetically embody unconditional self-love has been the journey of a lifetime. And when I witness the way beautiful, sensitive souls self-harm, disconnect, act in a multitude of addictions and destructive behaviors, I am reminded at its core, over and over, we have been taught to seek love externally. Even religion and spirituality are often an attempt to seek outside of the self. For me, learning to explore, to love, to witness, and to alchemize all of the weapons I used against myself in order to become part of a culture I was never supposed to identify with, has taught me that all human beings intrinsically have to meet God within first and foremost. If we can meet the divine creator, the divine spark, the divine intelligence within ourselves unconditionally, we can then literally take on anything else, because we will understand collectively we are all sparks of the creator, and we all have that innate ability to transform and to be a miracle. But it begins through radically loving ourselves fully, madly, deeply, messily, and truly.
Thank you so much for spending time with me today and having this conversation. It is always a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you loved this episode, please consider leaving a review. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so we don't lose each other. And to share the link with somebody who can appreciate this message. Blessings to you all, and I hope to catch you on my next episode.